Alright, so before we start, let me give you the big picture of how this power grade is laid out. As I mentioned earlier, the entire node tree is designed to mimic a real film pipeline, from capture to print all the way to the final editing. So instead of just random corrections thrown around, there's a clear structure to how everything flows and how you should approach grading your video. So first, we prep the image. That's the denoise, camera matching, and color space transforms. Basically, all the technical stuff to get your footage into the right shape before any grading begins. Then, we move on into primary image correction and balancing. This is where we fix things like exposure, contrast, and white balance, all the foundation work. After that comes the fun part, the creative phase. And even that phase is split into sections. First, we've got the development section, that's where the film stocks and color shaping come in. Then, we've got the effects section, which is broken down into two parts, the masks and creative effects. The mask part is for targeted corrections, for things like lighting control, isolating colors, adding separation between subject and background, and a lot more. And finally, the creative effects, things like bloom, halation, and graying. All the elements that give your image mood and texture. Right at the end, we've got our final output transform and the two check nodes for clipping and skin tones. And I know, that's a lot, but think of this whole structure like baking a cake. You prep your ingredients first, then you mix your base, bake it, decorate it, and finally plate it up for serving. You can't start by decorating the cake if you haven't even made the base. Every step matters, and if you skip one or rush through it, it's gonna show in the final result. Alright, now we're getting to the part that everyone's been waiting for, the individual nodes breakdown. I'm gonna walk you through each key node in the power grid, explain what it does, how it's set up, and how to tweak it depending on your footage. So let's start with the first node in the chain, the denoise node, and trust me, this one is very important. Now before we begin, you won't be able to fully see the effect of the denoise node right now, obviously because the image is still in log format and everything is super flat. So what I'm gonna do is I'll go through the explanation here, and once I do the camera matching, I'll come back to show you the visual difference. So for those of you who don't know, what even is noise? Noise is that grainy, static looking texture you get in your image, especially in the shadows or when shooting in low light or with high ISO. And this is a problem because once you start grading, pushing contrast, saturation, adding LUTs, or using powerful tools like qualifiers, DCTLs, or color warpers, the noise gets amplified. And that means that you have an image with less quality and detail, which will create a less professional and less engaging visual experience for your viewer. And to clarify, it's not any of those tools that I mentioned that will cause that noise. It's just that any strong adjustments will bring out the imperfections already present in your image. So that's why denoising first is critical. Now, unfortunately, this denoise feature is only available in the DaVinci Resolve Studio, not the free version. But honestly, this node alone is worth the upgrade. But of course, if you don't have access to it, the next best thing is to make sure that you or your client shoots footage that's as clean as possible. And that means good lighting, proper ISO, exposed well, all of that already goes a long way. And again, this node becomes especially important if you're using any strong effects, but specifically with my LUTs or DCTLs, they are designed to be smooth and cinematic, but they will definitely reveal problems if the base image is already very noisy. Now let me show you how to access the denoise controls. So all that you gotta do is go to the bottom left of your screen, click on the motion effects panel, and then you see both the temporal and spatial noise reduction settings right here. And as you can see, by default on the power grade, I've already set the chroma spatial threshold to 19.5, and that's intentional. For low to medium noise, this setting gives you great results without making the image blurry. And for me, I like to keep things simple. So 80% of the time, I don't touch anything else, and this is the only setting that I'll have on. So again, if your footage is low in noise to medium in noise, this is the only adjustment that I personally recommend. You can play around with the spatial mode or radius if you want, but honestly, I rarely do. One important tip though, never push the chroma threshold above 20. It will start pulling color away from parts of the image that weren't even noisy in the first place and will start to break your image. Now let's say that you're dealing with medium to high noise. So here's what I recommend instead. You're gonna go to this section right here and focus on the temporal noise reduction. All you gotta do is set it to 5 frames, use better for motion estimation, and adjust the motion range. And what's the motion range? Basically, the more movement, there is in your shot, the higher you need to set it, but don't go overboard. So if your footage is mostly still, keep it low. If the subject or camera is moving a lot, bump it up. And you can experiment again with other sliders too, but one thing that I always tell my students is this: keep it as simple as possible. And that's just not for the denoise, it's for color grading in general. If you're grading a 15-minute project or even a feature film, those extra 2 to 3 minutes per clip add up to hours. So unless the shot really needs it, don't waste the time chasing tiny improvements. This clip right here is pretty clean. Again, you're not going to be able to see it yet, but I'll show it to you in a sec, so I'm just leaving the default settings, the spatial chroma at 19.5 and everything else off. And one final tip for everyone, denoising is super powerful, but also very, very demanding on your computer. So even with a very good computer or a top spec Mac Studio like my one, if I crank up the denoise settings for heavy noise, the ones that I show you, the playback starts glitching. So in this case, the best and easiest way to deal with this is very, very simple. All you gotta do is turn off the denoise node while you do the edit and only turn it back on for the final export. And of course, just make sure that the noise isn't so bad, you have so much noise that you can't even see what you're doing if you leave the denoise node off. Otherwise, you'll be grading blind, so in that case, leave it on. But if you have not a lot of noise, just leave it off. And that's it for this node. Very simple, powerful, and a huge time saver if you set it right from the start. Next up is the camera to DaVinci Wide Gamma node, and this is where the color management starts. I've already set the output here to DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate, which is resolves the internal color space in Gamma. Just to explain quickly, the color space defines the range of colors your image can contain, and the Gamma controls how the brightness levels, like the shadows, midtones, and highlights, are distributed. DaVinci Wide Gamut is a really large color space, even bigger than Rec 2020 or ACES, for example. It's designed to hold as much color information as possible, no matter what camera you're using. DaVinci Intermediate is the matching gamma curve that's optimized for grading. It spreads out the tonal values evenly so you don't get harsh roll-offs or weird contrast bumps. Basically, this combo gives you a clean, flexible foundation that behaves consistently across all footage. And what you need to do in this node is set the input color space and gamma that match how your footage was recorded. For this project, an ARRI camera was used, so select ARRI Wide Gamut 3 and log C4. And if you're using something else, like Sony S-Log, Canon C-Log, Blackmagic Film Red, all of that, just choose the correct input based on your camera settings. If you're not sure what your camera uses, check the recording menu on your camera or look it up on the manufacturer's website. They'll usually list whether it shoots in Log C, S-Log 3, PMD film, and so on. And here's a quick tip for beginners. Even if your camera can shoot in log, if it's only 8-bit color like the Sony a7 II or 3 for example, you should not be shooting in log. 8-bit color footage in log format doesn't hold enough data for grading and will fall apart when you start pushing things. And in that case, you should shoot in Rec 709. And also select Rec 709 as your input here. It will give you the cleanest and most stable results. So again, outputs are already set to DaVinci Wide Gamut and Intermediate, and all you need to do is match the inputs to your specific camera. And once those are set, you already see that the image shifts into a much better state. Neutral, balanced, and ready to grade. So that's it for this node. Short, simple, but one of the most important steps in the entire workflow. Now we are on to the primaries, which is honestly the most important part of the whole grade. This is where we're going to clean up the image before adding any creative looks. The goal here is to fix exposure, contrast, white balance, and overall balance, so the image is technically solid before we move on. You can think of this one like laying the foundation of a building. If this part is off, even a little bit, it's going to mess everything up later when you start pushing color or applying looks. This part is set up inside a compound node. And even though earlier I said you should always work through the nodes in the order they are laid out, this is the one exception. The subnodes inside here aren't arranged in the exact order I recommend working through, so just follow this workflow instead. Balance and exposure using the lift, gamma, gain, and offset wheel. Contrast, setting the image separation and pivot. Clipping fix, recovering the blown out highlights or crushed shadows. Saturation, for global color intensity. White balance, dialing in the temp or tint. Printer lights, and the curve adjustments. which you only use these two if needed. And that's the order I recommend. You understand why as we go through it. Also, this is a section where we'll be using the clipping and skin tone check nodes the most, especially early on. And this is to fix any initial clipping and to make sure that the image is balanced properly before we start grading. I'll show you how that works in a second, but just a quick reminder, I won't be spending too much time explaining the check nodes in detail here, since there are dedicated videos that go deep into them. Alright, so first up is the balance and exposure node. This is where we get the image in the right ballpark. We're not doing anything creative yet, just bringing it to a technically solid starting point. And the tools I'm going to be using here are the basics: lift, gamma, gain, and offset, or in other words, the primary wheels. I usually like to start with the offset to push the whole image up or down and get the overall exposure into a better general position. Then I go in with the lift to control the shadows, the gain for the highlights, and gamma to adjust the midtones and shape the contrast a little bit. Now, even though we have the clipping check node, we are not using it just yet in this step. For now, just focus on how the image looks in your viewer. Use your eyes. Ask yourself, does this feel properly exposed? Do the shadows feel right? Are the highlights overblown? Learning to trust your eye is a skill that you build as you grade more. Tools are helpful, yes, but this is also an art form. The goal isn't to chase numbers. It's to make an image that feels balanced. That said, it's still a good idea to glance at your waveform while you're doing this, just to make sure you're heading in the right direction. Very simply, the bottom of the waveform represents pure blacks, the top is pure white. And most of your image should generally sit somewhere in the middle, not crushed at the bottom or slammed at the top. Of course, this will vary depending on the scene. A night shot versus a high-key studio setup won't behave the same, but this gives you a rough sense. Alright, so I'm gonna start grading now. I'll go ahead and adjust the offset, then tweak the lift, gamma, and gain based on what I see. Now that I've got things looking solid, let's quickly turn on the clipping check node just to see if anything is actually clipping. And at this stage, there's probably going to be a little clipping somewhere, usually in the shadows, and that's totally fine. If you're seeing just a little bit, like I am here, don't worry, we're gonna fix that in the next step. But if the clipping is too extreme, like if you see large areas of solid red or blue, then that's a sign that you might need to go back and adjust the wheels a bit more. The goal right now isn't to completely remove clipping, whether it's in the shadows or highlights. It's just to make sure that nothing looks totally broken and that the image feels good to your eye. And if you don't see clipping at all, that's great. Move on. If you see a little bit, that's okay too. Just keep moving forward. So next up is the contrast. And this is where we start adding separation and structure to the image. Still nothing creative yet, just refining the technical base. First, if you still have the clipping check node on from before, go ahead and turn it off now. We're not using it in this step. The tools we're using here are the contrast and pivot, which work together. Contrast increases the difference between bright and dark areas. It makes the image pop a little bit more, adds depth, and creates a stronger definition. And the pivot controls where that contrast is applied. Lower pivot pushes the contrast more into the shadows, and higher pivot pushes it towards the highlights. Just like the previous step, this is a visual adjustment. You're not trying to make it look cinematic or stylized. The goal is for the image to feel balanced and natural, with a bit more depth. And as you're adjusting, keep an eye on the waveform. Not to chase the perfect numbers, but just to make sure that nothing crazy is happening. You want a clean distribution of shadows, midtones, and highlights. Nothing crushed or blown out. So once that's done, go ahead and turn the clipping check node back on. If you see a little bit of clipping in the shadows or highlights, that's totally fine. We're going to fix that in the next step. Alright, now we're at the clipping fix node, and the sole purpose of this node is to fix any clipping in the image. So first, make sure that your clipping check node is turned on. That's the only way you see what needs fixing. If you don't see any clipping, then perfect, you can move on. But in most cases, especially right after adjusting contrast, you'll probably see some clipping, usually in the shadows. So to fix this, we're going to switch over to the HDR wheels. These are much better for controlling specific parts of the image, like just the highlights or just the shadows, without messing up the whole grade. Like I said, most of the time you see clipping in the shadows, so let's start there. In the HDR panel, click the little arrow at the top left until you are on the black wheel. First, push the exposure wheel all the way up. Most likely, nothing will happen, and that's normal. So next, go to the range wheel on the side. This controls how much of the blacks are being targeted. Slowly increase that until the clipping disappears. But now, you see that the blacks look way too bright, so go back to the exposure wheel and start bringing it down slowly. Keep lowering it until the clipping shows up again. Then nudge it back up, just enough for it to barely disappear. You use the exact same process for highlight clipping, but instead of the black wheel, just switch over to the highlight wheel. But this time, you do the opposite. Start by lowering the exposure, then adjust the range until the clipping starts to go away, and finally bring the exposure back up just enough so the image stays clean without over flattening the highlights. And that's it. Clean, simple, and you're ready to move on. So next up is the saturation. And in this node, I've set it up a little differently than the default and than what people are used to. This node is built in the HSV color space, which means it separates hue, saturation, and value. Basically the color, the intensity, and the brightness, all into different channels. By doing this, we are able to adjust only the saturation without messing up with the brightness or contrast of the image. It gives you more control and avoids those weird shifts you sometimes get when using the default saturation slider. So instead of using the saturation knob, what you do here is go back to the primary wheels and adjust the gain wheel. That's what's controlling the saturation in this setup, not the image brightness like it usually does, just the color intensity. There's no check node for saturation like we have for clipping or skin tones, so this is one of those steps that you have to do it entirely by eye. And what you're looking for is a healthy balance, not too washed out and not too punchy or oversaturated. A good way to check is to look at the skin tones or neutral areas in the image. If the skin is looking too pale or too orange, or if the image overall looks too muted or too cartoonish, then the saturation is probably off. And again, this is not the time to go for a look. You're not trying to make anything pop here or add a mood. This is just to bring the image to a clean, neutral, and technically correct place. Alright, next up is the white balance. And this is honestly one of the most crucial parts in our primaries. If the white balance is off, everything else will feel off, no matter how good your contrast, LUT, or creative look is. This step can make or break your image. In this node, I'm using the chromatic adaptation tool instead of the regular temperature and tint sliders. And the reason why is that this is a more scientifically accurate method that simulates how your eyes adjust to different lighting environments. You give it a non-light source like daylight or tungsten, and it adapts the image so that it looks neutral to the viewer. And the only thing that we're going to be changing here is the source illuminant, the Kelvin and tint at the top. That gets us into a better neutral place. And after that, we move on to the offset wheel for fine tuning. Now if you're on the free version of Resolve, you won't have chromatic adaptation. So first, disable that at the top and then just use the offset wheel directly. It works fine. Same approach as before. Start by adjusting by eye without the skin tone check on yet. Your goal here is to get a clean balance between skin tones and the background. Nothing should feel too warm or too cold. Once you've made the initial adjustments, then you can turn on the skin tone check node to see how close you are. Just a quick reminder, here's what the colors mean in the check node. Yellow, a good skin tone. Green, it's too yellow or too green. Blue, it's too magenta or too cold. After that, gently tweak the offset wheel to try to land more of the skin into the yellow range. But keep this in mind, it's never going to be perfect, and that's okay. If your subject has natural skin imperfections like a rash, redness, or makeup, some areas won't land in the perfect tone, and that's normal. Don't try to force them in. Another thing to avoid is pushing the entire image into yellow or red just to get the correct skin tones. Yes, the skin might technically look right, but now the whole image is tinted the same way and looks flat. There's no separation between the subject and the background anymore. So that's why we do the first pass by eye, then you turn the check node on, make small corrections if needed, and keep checking that the overall image still feels natural and has depth. It's a balancing act. Sometimes you get it nearly perfect, sometimes the footage won't allow it. For example, if the shot was meant to look like nighttime with blue lighting, we're not going to force it into a full daylight warmth. We just want to bring the image to a technically clean but visually real starting point. One more thing, the skin tones are your best white balance guide. If the skin looks right, your white balance is probably good. If there are no skin tones in the shot, you have to go by feel. Look at neutral objects like white or gray clothing, walls, or anything that should look colorless. You can also check the RGB parade. If one channel is way higher than the other in a neutral part of the image, that's a sign that your balance is off. And again, this takes practice, but the more you grade, the sharper your eyes gets. Alright, now let's go over the last two nodes in the primary section, the printer lights and the curves. These are optional tools, and in most cases, you won't need to touch them. I personally don't use them often, only in very specific situations. But I left them here in case you want to experiment or take a more advanced route. So first, the printer lights. These are actually based on real photochemical film printing. Back in the day, when film was developed, colorists will literally shine light through colored filters, red, green, and blue, to control how much of each color hits the final print. DaVinci gives us a digital version of that. And to use them, you gotta go to the top menu in the color page and click where it says printer lights. You see three options: full, half, and quarter. That's just how strong the adjustment is. Full is a big push, quarter is a subtle push, half in between. And they are super intuitive. If the image feels too yellow, hit minus yellow. Too magenta, minus magenta. Too blue, minus blue. Use them based on what you see. If you go too far, just hit Command Z and try again. Now I recommend using printer lights only if the previous white balance steps didn't get you where you wanted. Also, sometimes the image is too far gone, maybe super warm or tinted weird, and printer lights can gently nudge it back in the right direction without wrecking everything else. But again, this is not a creative tool, it's for technical correction when offset or chromatic adaptation couldn't do the job fully. Now the second optional node is curves. I left this in just for those of you who want to experiment a little bit more. The white curve lets you control the brightness of the shadows, mids, and highlights more selectively. And it's very useful if you want to adjust the contrast without messing up the color balance. Personally, this is the node in the grade where I use the least. All the other tools we already gone through give me a much better and more controlled results. So think of curves as something you can play around with later once you're more comfortable. And if you're starting out, I would say don't worry about it for now, just focus on getting clean results with the steps we already covered. Alright, and that wraps up our primary section. And before you move on, make sure to turn on the clipping check node and the skin tone check node back on, just for one final pass. This is your chance to catch anything small that might have slipped. A bit of clipping, a skin tone shift, whatever. It's a habit that will save your grade down the line. Now here's another super important skill that you gotta learn early on. If something feels wrong, like the contrast is off, the colors are weird, or the skin tones don't look right, turn all the nodes off in the primary section and then turn them back on one by one in the exact same order that you graded them. This will help you spot exactly where things went off track. And if something looks wrong, just redo that step. And hey, redo the whole thing if needed. That's the process. This step is very crucial and you've gotta get it right before you move on to any creative work. Right now, I'll talk about the primaries node on and off so you can see what we've done. This is the before, and this is the after. A clean, natural, properly balanced image. That's our foundation. From here, we can build anything. Right, now we finally get to the part that everyone thinks grading is about. You've been patient enough through the boring technical bits, the contrast, the white balance, the exposure, and now it's time to actually create a look. This is the heart of whatever visual identity you want to build. Whether it's gritty realism, warm nostalgia, stylized surrealism, or a proper filmic look, you're stepping into the creative development phase of the Paraguay. This is where the image starts to take on its character, and we touch a lot on negative development, film stocks, film print, masks, effects, and more. All of this is what gives your image that crafted, intentional, and cinematic finish. But heads up, none of this works if your foundations are broken. So if your primaries aren't right, you're just polishing a mess. So if you skipped ahead, go back and fix that first. Now let's jump into the film stocks, where the mood starts to take form. This is the core of the look that you're going to create. So depending on the package that you bought, you may not have access to the different film stocks. If you're on the lower tier with the power grade only, then you just have access to the GR Cinema. But that's already a solid, flexible starting point. And of course, you can still use any LUTs that you want right here. Well, I highly recommend, of course, using mine. These LUTs were developed over months of using extremely advanced tools and techniques. And they are made to work seamlessly with this workflow, without breaking your image or creating weird artifacts. I even created a dedicated video just to walk through all of the film stocks, so I'm not going to go deep into each one right here, but the process is very simple. All the film stocks live inside a single compound node. You turn on the stock that you want and keep the others off. They are divided into normal strength and stronger strength. But I personally highly recommend starting with the normal strength. You can always blend the stocks later if you want to add more punch. Once you activate a film stock, it might not look perfect out of the box, and that's totally normal. These are designed to emulate real film stocks, and real film doesn't magically fit every single shot, so that's why we tweak them. Right at the front of the compound node, there's a creative white balance node that affects all the film stocks. Just go to that node and use the offset wheel to balance the image creatively. Push it until the skin tones and the overall look feel right to your eye. You can switch between stocks and test them with the same white balance, or adjust each one slightly to see what fits best. Now you want to mix multiple film stocks? Of course you can. So here's how. You're going to turn on more than one stock inside the compound node. You're going to go to the node key tab, look for the key output gain. That's basically the opacity of the node. 1 is full strength and 0 is completely off. And then dial it down for each stock until you find a mix that you like. The stronger versions of the stocks work exactly the same, but they hit harder. If you activate one and it's too intense, I recommend doing this. First, go to the key output gain and lower it to a softer level. Then, and only then, you adjust the creative white balance node to make sure that it sits right with your footage. And you can use the same key output gain slider outside the compound nodes as well. So once you've picked and balanced a film stock, you might feel like it's a bit too strong. So just lower the compound node gain to reduce the entire effect. And this concept applies to any and every single node in DaVinci Resolve. Masks, effects, and creative looks. You always have the option, of course, to get everything right inside the node. But then, if you want to reduce the intensity afterwards, you can. So that's it for the film stocks. They're the soul of the look, and with the flexibility built into this power grade, you can tailor it perfectly to your footage. This part becomes the foundation of your creative look. You can leave the stock at higher strength for something more filmic, dial it down for a commercial clean vibe, or the white balance for a stylized feel, or go cooler for something moody. This is where the creative part begins. After you've chosen your film stock and balanced the white balance inside the compound node, you might feel that the image still needs a bit more punch. That's exactly what this next node is for, creative contrast adjustment. So use this node to shape the final contrast of your look, based on the mood and vibe you're going for. This isn't about fixing exposure or being technically perfect, it's about enhancing the feel. Here you'll be using the same tools as before, the contrast and pivot sliders. These tools are perfect for pushing the image into a more dramatic or stylized place. If you've done everything right to this point, this adjustment alone should get you most of the way there. But before you start, turn on the clipping check node on. It's the only way you'll know if you're introducing any clipping during this step. Now after making those contrast changes, it's possible that you introduce some clipping, especially in the shadows or highlights. Generally, you should try to fix that clipping within the contrast and pivot tools themselves. If clipping appears, it's probably because you pushed the contrast too far or didn't balance it properly with the pivot, so adjust those first. However, if there's still some clipping, even after that, then you can bring out the HDR method back in, but only to clean up the clipping, not to shape the contrast itself. And if you see clipping, like we did before, use the black or highlight wheels in the HDR panel. But again, don't go overboard here. Keep in mind that we're still going to do targeted adjustments with masks later, so leave flexibility in your grade. This is supposed to be a subtle adjustment. Once you're happy with the contrast and clipping is under control, toggle your skin tone check node on, just to see how things are going overall. Since this is a creative phase, you don't need perfect skin tones. For example, a desert vibe might push the skin tones more into the yellow part. A cold, nighttime mood might lean towards the blue side. And that's totally okay. It's intentional. Just make sure that you are aware of what you're doing and that it still supports the final look that you're going for. And of course, if you're aiming for something like a clean commercial grade, then you might want to stay closer to ideal skin tones. But even then, the film stocks and contrasts here are about style, not clinical precision. Now we move on into the negative development phase, and this is where things really start to take shape. Think of this section as the foundation of your creative intent. Just like in traditional film processing, the negative development stage is where the original captured image starts being shaped into something more stylized and intentional. It's not about effects or finishing touches, it's about molding the raw material into the direction you want. This is where we begin shaping the density, roll-off, response curves, and color behavior, setting the groundwork for the final aesthetic that you push further with film prints, masks, glow, grain, and everything else. Basically, this part is all about how the image feels, how it rolls from shadows into mids, into highlights, how it compresses color, and how the base image reacts to adjustments that follow. It's not flashy, but it's essential. We are not going to throw wild looks here. We are going to guide the image into a space that feels cinematic, natural, or however you want, with purpose and control. So let's dive in. So the first node inside the negative development section is the creative printer lights. We've already seen printer lights earlier in the primary section where we use them to gently fix white balance when things went too far off. But here, it's a totally different game. This time we are using them creatively, not to fix anything, but to add a subtle color cast that enhances the mood. Think of it like this, a gentle warm push for a golden hour feel, or maybe a slightly green or blue tint for something cooler or moodier. It's a minimal yet very effective tool for steering the emotional tone of the shot. That said, I rarely use this node myself. Not because it isn't useful, but because most of the time I get what I need from the other tools that come next into the negative development section. And they are also much more accurate. But it's here if you want that extra bit of control. Right next into the negative development chain is the color warper. Now I want to be upfront about this now. This is an incredibly powerful tool, especially if you haven't invested in my GR Advanced DCTL pack. Think of this as a built-in alternative. The DCTLs, which we'll get to in a moment, do a similar job, but of course in a much more intuitive, precise, and frankly better way with more advanced controls. However, I left the color warper here because I want the spark gray to be flexible for everyone. So if you don't have the DCTLs, this is your go-to for targeted creative color adjustments. I personally don't use it much anymore, but understanding it is a fantastic skill to have. So what does it do? Its main purpose is creative color separation. It allows you to reach into the image, grab a very specific color, and change its hue, saturation, or brightness without affecting everything else. The best analogy is this. Think of the color warper as a set of surgical tweezers. While the primary wheels are like using your hands to move things around, the warper lets you perform a delicate operation on one tiny part of the image. Now the warper has a few different modes, like the chroma warp and the chroma versus luma, but honestly, for the sake of time, and because even before I developed my DCTLs, I rarely use them, we are going to focus exclusively on the hue versus saturation mode. It's the most direct and effective for our purpose. Okay, before we start, a quick heads up on a common glitch in DaVinci Resolve you might run into. Sometimes when you're inside a compound node like this, when using the color warper, you select the eyedropper 2, but when you hover over the footage, the little cross on the graph doesn't move at all. So to fix this, you just need to first go back out of the compound node to the main node tree, select any other node, go to the color warper panel in that node, and just hover your mouse over the viewer. You don't need to click anything, but you'll see that the cross on the graph starts working. Now go back inside our negative development compound node, select the color warper again, and the eyedropper will work perfectly. It's a weird bug, but that's the quick fix. Alright, so with that sorted, here's the workflow I recommend. First, grab the qualifier tool, the little eyedropper, and click on the color in your footage you want to adjust. So for example, let's say I want to adjust the yellow on this player's jersey. You see that a control point appears on the grid. Now what most people do is just dragging the point around, but don't do that. The most controlled way to make an adjustment is to use the hue, saturation, and luminance sliders that appear on the right. This gives you a precise, repeatable control over your change. You can just nudge the hue slider to pull out the green, and maybe boost the saturation a touch. That's it. Pick a color, use the sliders, very simple. Now here's a crucial tip that many people miss, the grid size. If you find your adjustment is affecting too much of the image or bleeding into colors you didn't want to touch, you probably need to increase the grid size. A larger grid makes the adjustments smoother and more isolated. Play with this setting. It's key to getting a clean result. And this brings me to the most important rule for this node. Do not overdo it. The biggest mistake you can make here is pushing things too far. This entire negative development section is for subtle adjustments, not creating a whole new look from scratch. If you find yourself making wild changes in the color warper, you've gone down the wrong path. This is for the final 5% refinement. So to recap, be cautious, use it for subtle, creative tweaks, and see it as a powerful option if you're not using my DCTLs. And speaking of which, let's move on into the next nodes, which are my DCTLs I keep talking about. This is where my personal workflow really comes alive. So now we're entering the territory of my GR Advanced DCTLs, and I want to start by saying a couple of things. First, I won't be going to extreme depth on these tools in this video because everyone who purchases them, either as a standalone or as part of the Ultimate Grading Suite, gets a separate dedicated video that breaks down every single function. So this will be more of an overview to show you how they fit into the workflow. Secondly, I want to explain why I created this. My goal is to take that very complex color science concepts and make them simple, intuitive, and powerful. I spent a huge amount of time coding and developing these tools based on my own unique authorial methods. You can't find this anywhere else. They're designed so you can get incredible results without needing a degree in color theory. The complexity is all under the hood. So let's start with the first one, the Hue Pro. If the color warper was like using surgical tweezers, this is like having 6 master dials, each perfectly calibrated to a major color. Its purpose is very simple, to give you direct and easy control over the hue of the 6 core color vectors: red, green, blue, cyan, yellow, and magenta. Now let me show you how it works. You can see the sliders in the Open Effects panel right here. So let's take the blue in this player's jersey for example. If I want to shift it slightly towards a cyan or purple, I just move the blue slider left or right. It's that simple. There's no grids, there's no points to pull, just a direct, clean adjustment. But where this gets even more powerful is when you combine it with Resolve's native tools, like Power Windows for example, for incredibly specific targeted adjustments. So watch this. See this tiny red patch on the Hawkeyes player's black jersey? Let's say I want to change the hue of only that red. First, I'll go to the Power Window panel and draw a quick mask right around it. Now, back in the Hue Pro settings, I can move the red slider and it only affects the color inside that window. I can make it more orange, more magenta, with perfect precision. Now this is impossible to do cleanly with most other tools. And of course, with great power comes great responsibility. So the less is more rule still applies here. But this DCTL is an absolute weapon for creating color separation. For instance, I can use the green slider to, in a very subtle way, shift the hue of the background boards, making the players pop even more. And another of my go-to uses for this on other projects is with footage that has a subject in front of trees, grass, or vegetation in general. Separating the specific hue of green in the vegetation from the yellow and red tones in the skin, it's something that I do on almost every grade, and this tool makes it effortless. So that's the Hue Pro, an incredibly powerful and intuitive way to control the specific hues of your image, whether you're making broad creative changes or hyper-targeted fixes. So moving on from the Hue Pro, we come to what is arguably one of the most powerful and unique tools in the entire suite, the GR Density Pro. So what even is density? It's a concept developed to solve a very common problem with digital color. Density, in simple terms, is the process of adding weight and richness to a color by reducing its brightness while also boosting its saturation. The best way to think about it is like reducing the water from a glass of fruit juice. The color becomes deeper, richer, and more concentrated. It makes digital colors feel less like light and more like pigment. So let me demonstrate. See the red on this player's helmet? I'm going to increase the red density slider. So instantly, it feels more solid, richer, and more like a deep, painted object rather than a piece of bright plastic. But you might notice that the player's face also got more red and saturated. This is where the magic comes in. Skin tones are made of reds and yellows. So yes, they are going to be affected. But now watch what happens when I increase the skin preserve slider. So just like magic, the DCTL automatically identifies the very specific tones of human skin and shields them from the adjustment. The helmet stays rich and dense, but the skin returns to a natural, balanced state. It's an automatic, perfect mask for skin. This DCTL also gives you incredible control over the relationship between density and saturation. So let's look at the blue on the jersey. If I increase the blue density, the color gets richer, but also more saturated. If that's too much color, I can use the corresponding blue desaturation slider to pull the saturation back, giving me independent control. This way I can make the blue darker and denser without making it over cartoonish or vibrant. You can even use the desaturation sliders by themselves if you just want to do targeted desaturation of specific colors. Now let's look at the global sliders and the other protection settings. So if I crank the global density slider all the way up, the whole image gets dense and heavy and the skin tones look terrible. But if I dial up the screen preserve, the face is rescued from the effect. The highlight preserve slider does the exact same thing, but for any bright colors in your highlights. This footage, of course, doesn't have strong highlights to show it on, but if you have a bright sky or a window in your shot, this slider will protect those areas from getting muddy. Personally, I use individual sliders a lot to deepen skin tones or control bright reds and yellows. I use the global sliders when I feel that the entire image needs more weight and depth, or if I want to create a more muted, less saturated look overall. Remember that we are deep into the creative section now. This is the place to be bold and define your style. But a word of caution. The math behind this tool is so good that it won't easily break your footage. However, its power is like giving a Ferrari to a first-time driver. If you slam the accelerator without knowing what you're doing, you're going to crash. This will give you any results that you want, but you need to respect its power. Keep it within the speed limits and only push it when the look calls for it. Finally, you notice on the ZZTL and also on the Hue Pro a global blend setting at the bottom. This is your master opacity control for the entire effect. It's incredibly important because it allows you to dial in that perfect look with the sliders, and then if it feels a little too strong, you can just blend it back globally for the final perfect touch. It's the one step to making the effect sit perfectly in a grid. Okay, so I know that not everyone watching this will have the studio version of Resolve or will have purchased my DCTL pack. And I want to make sure that there was still a free alternative for you to add the sense of weight to your image. So that's why I created this next node, a full density node. This is a simple component node designed to do one thing, adding global density across your entire footage. It's very similar in effect to only using the global density slider in my DCTL. There are no settings to tweak inside, it's just a node you turn on and off. To explain the difference, let's use an analogy. Think of the Density Pro DCTL as a Swiss Army knife. It has 20 different tools, a specific blade for red, a tool for skin, another for highlights, and so on. This compound node, on the other hand, is just the main blade. It's still a good, sharp blade, and it's very useful for its one single purpose, but it's not the entire toolkit. So let me show you. I'll just turn it on. So can you see how it adds the depth and weight to the whole image? It's a nice effect and it's a great way to add some richness for free. However, the comparison to DCTL shows you the value of having those advanced controls. With this node, you can't add density to just the red helmet, you can't protect the skin tones, you can't control the saturation of the blue jersey. It's an all or nothing adjustment. So think of this as a great starting point and a taste of what the density concept can do. It's here for you to use, of course, but the real creative control and problem-solving power lies within the DCTL. It's the difference between a simple on and off switch and a full control panel. Alright, so let's cover the final node in our negative development section, the roll-off node. This is a subtle but incredibly important touch for making our digital footage feel more organic and filmic. So what's a highlight roll-off? One of the biggest giveaways of digital video is how highlights are handled. Often they hit a hard, absolute limit and just clip, creating a harsh, unnatural look. The best way to explain it is with an analogy. Think of your highlights on a waveform scope like a mountain range. Without the roll-off, the brightest parts are like a cliff edge. They go up and then they just stop abruptly. It looks ugly and feels artificial. What we want is a gentle, natural slope at the peak, where the brightness smoothly transitions into pure white. So that's a roll-off. So let me show you. Keep your eye on the brightest reflections on the ice and on the players' helmets. I'm just going to turn this node on. So see that? It's subtle, but the harshness is gone. The highlights just feel softer and more pleasing. If you look at the very top of your waveform, you see that those peaks get gently pulled down, taking the hard, digital edge off the top. And how does this work? In simple terms, this node is making a very precise adjustment using Da Vinci's HDR wheels, specifically targeting the highlights and gently bringing them down to create a smooth compression. So this is a preset node. I've dialed it in to what I feel is a sweet spot that works on every footage. So for 99% of your shots, all you need to do is turn it on and move on. And remember that when you're grading a full project, every second counts, and having a one-click solution for perfect highlight roll-off is a massive time saver. But if you are an advanced user and you feel a specific shot needs more or less of this effect, you can always go into the HDR wheels yourself and tweak the highlight exposure. But to be honest, I recommend just leaving it on as it is. And with that, we finished the negative development phase. We shaped our color with our Hue Pro, controlled the richness with the density, and now polish the highlights with a roll-off. We have truly defined the core character of our image, and now we are ready to move on to the final printing and finishing stages of the grade. Okay, so now with our negative developed, we move on to one of the most important stages for achieving a true cinematic look, the printout stage. So let me explain this with a real-world film analogy. Everything we've done so far, balancing, adding a film stock, tweaking the colors and density, has been like developing the camera's negative. Now we have to simulate the process of printing the negative onto a final motion picture print stock. This step is what audiences would actually see in a theater. For this, I've been inspired by one of the most legendary print films in cinema history, the Kodak Vision 23A3. The look of so many iconic movies was defined by this single stock. This node is designed to give you the final piece of the puzzle. It's not meant to be a heavy adjustment. Think of it as the final, beautiful chemical wash that polishes the image before it's finished. So let's look inside the compound node. You see they have 3 different options for the LUTs, a white balance node, and a gamma fix node. Now for the fastest workflow, I suggest leaving the internal white balance and gamma nodes alone. However, they are absolutely there for you to use creatively. You could definitely go into the white balance node to give the print a warmer or cooler feel, or use the gamma fix to create a softer, lower contrast version of the print look. They work exactly like the ones we've covered before on the film stocks. But let me show you the main workflow. First, I'm going to show you the 3 different options. As I turn them on, you see that they are all very strong and intense. They are not different strengths, but 3 completely unique emulations. So here's option 1, here's option 2, and here's option 3. Right, so personally I like the character of option 1, so I'll leave that one active. Now obviously, this is way too strong, so here's the key step. Exit the compound node, go to the key panel on the right, and find the key output gain. This is your intensity slider. I'm going to pull this all the way down to a point where it feels right to my eye, where it's adding that polish without overpowering the image. And now that this is blended in beautifully, I'll turn on the entire node on and off so you can see the final effect. See that? It's the final step that just polishes the whole image. It makes it strong and impactful, and it gives that beautiful quality to it. It ties everything we've done together into one cohesive cinematic look. Next up, we have the split toning node. And I want to be very clear about this one. This is a final, subtle, creative touch. Most of the time, I actually leave this node turned off. All of your main adjustments should be done by now. But if you've done everything and you feel that the image needs an extra little push into a specific color direction, say you want a slightly more greenish or a moody feel, this is the place to do it. And my method for this is a bit unique. Inside this compound node, you'll find 2 empty nodes, split 1 and split 2, and here's how we use them. The idea is to first push the image to an extreme in split 1, and then use split 2 to pull it back to a workable, pleasing point. The reason for this push and pull method is to really embed those new color tones deep into the image data. Let me show you how I would create a subtle greenish look for this shot. First, in split 1, I'm going to push the image way too far into the green. For this, I like to use the offset wheel, and for more precision, I might also use the individual RGB adjustment sliders right below it. As you can see, this looks terrible and it's obviously way too green, but that's the point. Now I'll move on to the split 2 node. Here, I'll use the offset wheel again, but this time to correct the image, pulling it back from the extreme green until it lands in a nice, subtle, stylized, sweet spot. Now I'll just turn the entire split 2 node on and off so you can see the final effect. So as you can see, it's a very subtle shift, but it gives the image a very distinct mood. Now I want to use this opportunity once again to remind you of a crucial technique that you can use on any and every single node. This technique once again is the key output gain. If you find that the split tone effect you created is still a bit too strong, you can always exit the compound node and just lower the gain to blend it back, making it even more subtle. But the main takeaway here is that less is more. Split toning should be a final whisper, not a loud shout. It's an optional step for when you need that last 1% of creative color shaping. Right, we are the last step of our core color adjustments before we get into things like masks and effects. This is a saturation 2 node. You might be wondering why there's a second saturation node here, since we already set up our base saturation in the primaries. The reason is that all the creative steps we just took, the film stock LUTs, the negative development, the print film annihilation, can sometimes shift the overall saturation of the image. So this node is here to give you one final creative pass to get it exactly where you want it. And this works the exact same way as the first saturation node we use, with the gain wheel controlling the saturation for a very precise and clean adjustment. You don't need to use this node if you don't want to, it's purely an optional creative choice. The best way to think of it is as the final master volume node for all the color intensity in your image. For this adjustment, I recommend you look purely at your image and decide what feels right. I'll show you how it works by moving the gain wheel up and down. You can add a final touch of pop, or you could even pull some saturation out for a more muted look. For this grade, I feel that the saturation is in a good place, so I'll leave it as it is. But the key takeaway is that if you do use this node, these are your final color adjustments, and they should be subtle. This is your last chance to tweak the overall color intensity before we move on. So we are now at the final node of our primary color pipeline, the trim node. I want you to pay close attention here, because the purpose of this node is very specific and very important. You might be thinking, if I see something wrong with the exposure or contrast, why don't I just go back to the primaries node and fix it? And the reason why you don't do that is because our entire look, the film stocks, the density, the print emulation, it's all calibrated to the signal that comes out of the primaries. So, if you go back and change the primaries now, the whole chain of adjustments could fall apart and you have to redo everything. And that's why the trim node exists. This is not a creative node, this is your emergency quick fix tool. Its only purpose is to fix any small technical problems you might notice at the very end, like a bit of unintentional clipping, a slight color inconsistency, or a minor contrast issue that appeared after all the look development. Ideally, if you see a big problem, you should use the method I talked about earlier. Turn off all the nodes and switch them on one by one to see where things went wrong. But for a small, quick fix, this node is your best friend. Personally, 9 out of 10 times, the only reason I'll even touch this node is to fix a tiny bit of clipping that I didn't catch earlier. And to make the fix, you can use any of the tools we've already learned, the primary wheels, the HDI wheels for clipping, whatever you need. But again, if you want to make a creative change, go back to the creative nodes like the film stocks or the negative development. This is only to fix things. So that analogy of a final, almost imperceptible buff or polish works perfectly here. But think of it this way, you're not adding a new coat of wax, you're just polishing out a tiny scratch or smudge you only notice at the very end. So looking at my image now, the grade is pretty good already, so I don't need to make any adjustments. I'll leave this node off. And with that, our core grade is complete. We've taken the image from a flat, log profile to a fully balanced and stylized look. Now we can move on to the next exciting phase, using masks for secondary corrections and adding the final cinematic effects. Alright, so with our core grade locked in, we move on to the next phase, which is personally my favorite part, the secondary corrections using masks. So far, every adjustment we've made has affected the entire image globally. Now, we're going to learn how to make targeted adjustments to very specific parts of the shot. This is how you take a good grade and make it great. It's how you draw the viewer's eye, fix distracting elements, or make creative changes to isolate your subject. In DaVinci Resolve, we do this using masks. A mask is simply a way of telling Resolve, hey, only apply this next adjustment to this specific area. There are several different types of masks we can use, like power windows, which are custom shapes you can draw, or the qualifier, which lets you select a specific color or brightness range. We'll get into how to use those in a moment, but the point is, masks give you precise control. This is how you change the color of just one player's jersey, brighten only a person's face, or add focus by subtly darkening the background. So in this power grade, I've set up 2 distinct sections for these adjustments. A section with parallel nodes and another with a layer node. Let me explain the purpose of each. So first you see 4 nodes labeled mask 1 through mask 4, all connected with a parallel mixer. This is your main general purpose area for secondary corrections. The reason we use a parallel structure here is crucial. It keeps every adjustment clean and independent. Each of these 4 nodes receives the exact same clean image from the previous step. This means that the adjustment you make on mask 1 will mess up or contaminate the adjustments you make in mask 2. So here's an analogy. Think of it like a team of 4 specialist painters working on the same portrait. One painter is in charge of only the red helmet, a second painter is dedicated to only the blue jersey, and a third focuses only on the skin tones. They all work independently at the same time without getting in each other's way. And at the end, their individual, expert adjustments all combine to create one perfectly detailed final image. And that's what this section is for. After the parallel nodes, you see a section that uses a layer mixer. In my workflow, I use this section for one specific and very important task, to isolate and adjust the background. We'll get more into the specifics of how to do this in a moment, but the logic is simple. The setup allows you to make a change that affects only the background of the shot, leaving your main subject completely untouched. A good analogy for this is to imagine putting a big sheet of tinted transparent film over your entire photo. This film changes the color or brightness of everything. Then you take out a pair of scissors and carefully cut out the shape of your main subject, lifting that piece of film off them. The result is that the tint now only affects the background, and that's exactly what this layer node setup is designed to do. So to recap, you have a flexible section for multiple independent adjustments and a dedicated, powerful section for controlling your background. Now that you understand the layout, let's dive in and actually build our first mask. Okay, so let's start with the first section, the 4 parallel nodes. Before we click anything, I want to quickly explain the best way to think about them to keep your work organized. Think of these 4 nodes as labeled folders in a filing cabinet. The goal is to keep all related adjustments together. For example, you might decide a workflow for this shot like this. Mask 1 will be my skin folder, so any adjustments I make to the player's faces or skin will go in this row. Mask 2 will be my lighting folder. This is where I'll create vignette or shape light. Mask 3 will be my wardrobe folder for any changes to the jerseys or helmets. And Mask 4 is a spare folder for anything else, like the background or the eyes. This way, if you ever need to tweak an adjustment, you know exactly which folder or node to go to. It's all about staying organized. So now we're going to look at the 3 main masking tools I use within these nodes. The power windows, the qualifiers, and the magic mask. So let's start with the power windows. These are essentially shapes you draw to select an area. You have several types like the circle, square, pen tool, and the gradient. But the single most important setting for any power window that you use is softness. A hard edge on a mask is a dead giveaway of a bad secondary correction. Always add softness to blend your adjustment naturally. So let's do an example from our wardrobe category. I'll use mask 3 for this. The black jersey on the player to the left is a bit dark and I want to brighten it. So first I'll select the circle, power window, and draw it over the jersey. I'll use the controls to resize and position it. Crucially, I'll increase the softness slider to feather the edge. To see my selection, I'll press Shift-H to toggle highlight mode. And now inside this node, I can just lift the exposure a bit to brighten the jersey. Perfect. Now, let's use mask 2 for a lighting category to create an effect that adds focus. First, I'll draw another circle window around both players' faces. And for this, I'll add plenty of softness. Then, I'll go to the power window panel and click the invert button. Now my mask is selecting everything except their faces. With the background selected, I'll just lower the exposure slightly. Instantly, the focus is pulled to the players. Now what about tracking? If your shot has movement, you need to track your power window. And to do that, just go to the tracker panel. And my tip is to first try tracking with perspective 3D enable, and if that gives you a weird result, turn it off and try it again. If the motion is too complex, you can always track manually. For that, you choose your starting point, move forward a few frames until there's enough change in the image, and then adjust the mask. This creates a new keyframe and you just repeat the process for the whole clip. Next up is a qualifier, which selects part of the image based on color, saturation, or brightness. My biggest rule here is to never use all three HSL, hue, saturation, and luminance qualifiers together. Try to get your selection with just one or two at the most. Using all three often creates a messy, noisy key. So let's do another wardrobe adjustment, this time on the red helmet. First, I'll go to the qualifier panel and use the eyedropper to click on the red helmet. In the hue controls, I can adjust the width and the softness to refine my selection. Softness here is just as important as it is in the power windows. And my main tip for cleaning up a selection is to use the clean black and clean white sliders, and sometimes adding a touch of denoise. This will give you a much smoother result. By default, a qualifier selects a color everywhere on the screen, so it doesn't need tracking. However, if you only want to qualify a color on a specific moving object, like this red helmet, and ignore the same red elsewhere, that's when you pair it with a power window. The qualifier selects the color, and the window tells it where to look, and then you track the window. Finally, let's talk about the magic mask. This AI tool is incredibly powerful, and with the recent updates, it became much more accurate. It's best used for when you need a very specific isolation that will be too difficult or time-consuming to get with other tools. My advice for the magic mask is very simple. First, with the magic mask tool selected, just click on the areas you want to select. You can select specific clothing, the entire person, or just the skin. You can also hold Option or Alt to click on areas you want to remove from the selection. In the settings, always change the mode to better. Then, just hit the tracking button to track your selection through the shot. I generally don't touch the other sliders unless I need to use the clean black or white to refine the edge. So that covers the main tools. But what happens when you need more than 4 folders, or you want more work within the same category? This is where adding new nodes come in. So here's the rule. If you use up all your 4 folders, you need a 5th one, a 6th one, completely separate category for a new task. You add a new parallel node by pressing Option P on Mac or Alt P on Windows. And if you want to perform a second related adjustment within the same folder, for example, if you use one node to brighten a person's entire face, and now you want to adjust just their eyes, you add a serial node after it by pressing Option S on Mac and Alt S on Windows. This way, you're going to keep all your adjustments chained together in the same row for better organization. This structure allows you to keep your grid organized while also giving you the flexibility to expand it for any project. Alright, so let's talk about the second masking section in SparkGrade, which uses a layer mixer. The entire purpose of this setup is to give you total control over the background of your image, separated from your foreground subject. Think of this as a way to split your image into 2 distinct pieces, the foreground and the background. In this section, we will not be changing the foreground at all. Any adjustments to your main subject should have already been done in the parallel nodes we've just covered. This section is for the background and the background only. So why would you even need to do this? There's a lot of creative reasons. Maybe you want to add a light ray effect that appears to be shining from behind your subject. Maybe you want to make the background a little darker and less saturated to create that classic subject pop effect. Or maybe you want to add a soft, white circle behind your subject to create a beautiful spotlight effect. This is a space for you to get creative with separating your subject from the environment. And here's a quick word of advice. To be honest, I don't always use this section. I try to achieve everything I can in parallel mask nodes first because they're often simpler and it can be easier to fix mistakes. This layer node setup is more powerful but also more complex. You have to be very careful with your selections because a bad selection, for example a messy one from a magic mask, can create noise or ugly edges around your subject. So here's the workflow for this section. It's based on how Layer Mixer works. The bottom node is for your selection. This is where you create a mask of your foreground subject. In other words, the part of the image you don't want to change. And for this, I suggest using either the magic mask, which we've already covered, or another powerful tool called the depth map. A depth map is a Resolve Studio feature that analyzes the image and creates a 3D map, allowing you to select things based on how close or far they are from the camera. You can follow the controls on it to get a clean selection of just your foreground. The top nodes are for your adjustments. Once your subject is selected or cut out by the bottom node, you can go to the nodes on top to make your changes. There are 2 nodes here, but you can always add more if needed. If you were to desaturate or lower the exposure in these top nodes, the effect would only apply to the background because the foreground, as I said before, is being protected by the mask on the bottom layer. And again, this section is incredibly powerful for effects-related work like light rays or creating the subject pop, but for most general secondary corrections, I recommend sticking to the parallel nodes we've covered before. Alright, so we now have finished our entire core grade, and now we move on to what I consider to be the most exciting, let's call it, part of the process. This next section is where the final magic happens. This is the final feel, the final layer of character that makes people look at work and say, damn. I want to be very clear. This is a very important section. This is what will set your footage apart. It's what elevates a grade from being technically correct to being something that people actually feel. This is the section that gives your footage character and emotion. It's often the difference between a good grade and a truly great, memorable one. Think of this section as your digital toolkit for recreating all the real-world factors that give an image its cinematic soul. It's like having access to all the beautiful imperfections and characteristics that come from using physical equipment. We're talking about digitally recreating the way specific lenses create beautiful blur, the way light creates a soft glow or halation on actual film stocks, or the effect of using physical filters or even atmospheric conditions like fog. Now, the most important piece of advice I can give you for this entire section is that how you use these effects depends entirely on your end goal. There's no single right answer. So for example, if you're creating a film emulation, you're probably going to go heavy here. You want to use effects like blur, halation, and grain to break down that clean digital look and make it feel more organic. But on the other hand, if you're creating a clean, high-end commercial, you'll be very subtle here. You might only add a tiny, almost invisible touch of glow or texture to give it a bit of polish. It all depends on the story that you're trying to tell. This section is what creates the character of your image. This is what will make your work stand out. So with that in mind, let's dive into the first effect in your chain and start building that character. Okay, so let's dive into our first creative effect, the background blur. This is an incredibly important tool for creating depth and making your image feel more three-dimensional and cinematic. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait, you call it background blur, but does it only affect the background? And the answer is no. So, why did you call it that then? And the reason is that my recommended way of using this effect is to always keep your main subject sharp and unaffected. So by blurring everything but your subject, you are, in effect, blurring the background. It's a powerful way to guide the viewer's eye and add a professional polish. Inside this compound node, you'll find 2 different methods for creating this effect. My personal favorite, which I use 99% of the time, is a radial blur. The second, however, is also another very powerful blur method. So let's start with the radial blur. This is my go-to because it's simple, fast, and looks fantastic. Inside this first node, there's already a circular power window mask waiting for you. To set it up, just go over to your power window panel and you see the circular mask is already active. You can then adjust it on screen. Your job is to place the inner circle over whatever part of the image you want to keep in focus. I highly recommend placing it on your main subject, and then you can play with the mask size and most importantly the softness to get a nice, smooth transition. Once the mask is set, I highly suggest you to only focus on changing 2 main settings for the effect itself: the smooth strength and the global blend. And how you use them depends on the vibe that you want. For a clean, Commercial look, if you just want to have a realistic blur to draw focus, you mainly adjust the smooth strength and leave the global blend at 100%. This will create a beautiful, clean depth effect. And for a dreamy, glowy vibe, you do the same thing, but after setting the strength, you pull down the global blend slider. You see that introduces a beautiful soft glow along with the blur. And here's a quick but important tip on tracking. If your subject moves, obviously you need to track this mask, but be careful because if your subject moves around a lot, tracking a tight mask can sometimes look unnatural. And to avoid this, you can either make the mask very large and soft so it only affects the outer edges of the frame, or sometimes for a more realistic feel, you can just leave the mask static in the center of the screen. The second option uses a more standard lens blur effect. So instead of a radial blur that comes from the center, this gives you a more uniform blur, which can also be very powerful. And you see that this method uses 2 nodes, which works similarly to the layer node setup we discussed earlier. The first node is for the selection only, and the second node is where you control the effects parameters. So on the first node, you would create a mask to select the area you want the blur to affect. On the second node, you control the look, and my suggested workflow is this. First, check the depth map preview box to get a visual representation of your blur area. Use the depth of field parameters to fine-tune the selection. Then, for the effect itself, I suggest mainly using the blur strength and global blend sliders, just like with the radial blur. You can also get creative and play with the lane hours settings if you want. So there's obviously a lot of controls here, and I won't go through every single one, but if you follow that order, you'll be in a great spot. The key message for both of these methods is to use them in a way that fits your specific footage and vibe that you're creating. They're very powerful tools, so subtle adjustments often work the best. So next one, we have one of the most iconic and distinct characters of real film, which is halation. So what is it? So let me explain to you in 2 different ways. From a technical standpoint, when shooting on celluloid film, very bright light sources can be so intense that they will hit the film, punch through the emulsion layers, reflect off the back pressure plate of the camera, and then re-expose the film from behind. And so this re-exposure primarily affected the red sensitive layer, creating a soft reddish-orange halo around the bright highlights. And in more simple terms, for those who just want to know what it looks like, it's that beautiful, soft, warmish glow you see around bright lights and highlights in old movies. It's a key ingredient that helps to break down the harsh, sterile look of digital footage and adds a layer of organic, nostalgic character. And now inside this compound node, you'll find that I've provided 4 different methods for creating halation. And before we get into them, you're probably asking why? Why 4? Why not just the best one? And the answer is that different methods work best for different types of footage. So there's no single best mode, but I highly encourage you to try all of them on your specific shot to see which one gives you the look that you feel is the best for your footage and that you like the most. With that being said, the 2 that I personally use the most more often are method 1, which is Da Vinci's built-in halation, and method 3, which is my own custom-built version. Method 1, Da Vinci's built-in halation, uses Resolve's own powerful halational effects tool. It's incredibly versatile. My advice here is to focus on the dial layer reflection section and experiment with the strength, the saturation, and the spread sliders. If you want an extra bloom effect on top, you can also play with the secondary glow section, but only after you're comfortable with the main effect. Now, for what part of the image gets affected, I've already preset the isolation parameters to be very realistic. This means that if you turn this node on and you don't see any halation, it's probably because the highlights in your specific shot aren't bright enough to realistically create it. However, if you do want to adjust what parts of the image are affected, you can just check the View Isolated Regions box and tweak the threshold slider. But remember, in real life, halation only appears on the strongest highlights. Method 2 is the Film Look Creator halation. This method also uses a built-in Resolve Studio tool. It's less powerful but very intuitive and easy to use. For this one, I highly suggest just using the Effects Blend slider to dial in the intensity. If you need more control, however, you can go down to the halation section and play with those sliders directly. Method 3 my custom halation, which is also friendly with the free version of DaVinci Resolve. So this is a method that I developed myself to manually recreate how halation works. And the best part is that this method works perfectly in the free version of DaVinci Resolve. It's a very, very powerful tool and very simple to control. All you gotta do is go inside this node group, select the highlights node, and in the qualifier, adjust the low and low soft sliders of the lunar range. And that's it. That one adjustment controls how much of the highlights the effect will grab. Method 4, a simple custom halation. This last method works the same way as my custom one, where you adjust the qualifier. However, it's a much more simplified version, and in my opinion, the results aren't quite as accurate or good looking, but it's here as another option for you to experiment with. For best practices, how strong should you make this effect? This goes back to the core philosophy of this section. It all depends on the look that you're creating. Halation is normally a subtle effect. For a clean, modern commercial look, 90% of the time, you won't even use halation at all. But if you're emulating a gritty 16mm film, you'll likely have a much stronger and more noticeable halation. Understand the look that you're aiming for and adjust to taste. Next up is the bloom, an effect that lives right next to halation and is often confused with it, but serves a very, very different purpose. So let's just quickly clear it up. Halation, as we discussed, is a very specific red-orange glow that emulates the chemistry of a film stock. Bloom, on the other hand, is a much more general effect. It simulates the way bright light scatters within the camera lens or in the atmosphere, creating a much softer, often source-colored or white glow. Its purpose is to take the harsh digital edge of your highlights and create a beautiful, soft, dreamy, and ethereal look. Inside this compound node, you'll find 4 different methods for creating bloom. The first 3 are each separated by strength: low, medium, and high. And the 4th is a custom node for you to experiment with. Alright, so method 1, the global bloom. This first method applies a bloom effect globally across the entire image. It's perfect for giving a whole shot that dreamy, very soft look. For this, my recommendation is to simply pick the strength that you like, low, mid, or high. And if you need to adjust intensity, only use a global blend slider. There are 3 strengths to give you enough variety. However, if you do want to play around more, you can go inside the nodes in the bloom section and you can mess with the radius. And you can also adjust the halation sections, radius, and amount. Now the reason I'm using halation tool here is that I modify it to affect the whole image and not give you the typical reddish yellow tint. It just adds a beautiful, pure glow. Still, for most cases, I recommend keeping it simple. Method 2, the highlight specific glow. This method is a more specific way of creating a soft glow that emanates primarily from the highlights of your image rather than the entire shot. And it also comes in 3 different strengths. For this one, if you need to make adjustments, I suggest only touching the shine threshold, the spread, the opacity, and the global blend sliders. And remember, you can use these effects together or even combine them with a power window. For instance, you can use this method with a window to add a beautiful soft glow to just a lamp in the background, for example. Method 3, the shadow and midtone glow. This method is designed to give you a bigger, softer glow to the shadows and midtones. While it also affects the highlights, you see that this makes the entire image feel more uniformly glowy and soft. For this one, I suggest keeping it very simple and only touching the global blend slider to control the intensity. Method 4, the custom glow node. This last node is a standard DaVinci Resolve's glow effect that I've left there for you to experiment with. I rarely use this one myself, but it's a great sandbox to create your own looks. This is a perfect place to share a great tip for learning Resolve. If you're ever unsure on what a slider does, just hover your cursor over its name for a second. And as you see, a little tooltip will pop up explaining its function in simple terms. And this will work for most effects in DaVinci. The key message here is to choose the method that best suits the creative look that you're after. And as always, being subtle is often your best friend. let's move on to the texture node. This is your control center for the final tactile feel of the image. Its softness, its sharpness, its grit. Just like our other effects, the purpose here is to add character and emotion to your footage. Why would you use this? Well, it all depends on the story that you're telling. Maybe you're emulating film, and real film is never as digitally sharp as a modern camera sensor, so you might want to use the blur tool to add a touch of organic softness. Maybe after all of your color adjustments, the image has lost a bit of its bite, and this is where you would use the sharpness tool to bring that crispness back. Or maybe you want to make the textures in the shot more prominent, to give it a grittier feel. So that's what the detail tool is for. So these nodes give you control over how your footage feels. As you can see, when you enter the compound node, I've broken it down into those three different categories: blur, sharp, and detail. And within each category, you have three pre-built strengths: the low, the mid, and high. And the workflow here is incredibly simple. You don't need to change any settings inside these nodes at all. So the first thing that you're going to do is decide which effect that you want. Then, just choose the strength you want and turn that single node on. And that's it. If you find that the effect is a little too strong, remember you can always use and adjust the key output gain of the node to blend it in perfectly. And yes, you can absolutely use this in conjunction with one another. For example, you can add a low blur for overall softness, and you can also add a touch of detail to make certain textures pop. But here's a quick word of advice on these tools. With sharpness, be very careful to not overdo it. Otherwise, you get those ugly, bright halos around the edges of things, which looks very, very digital. With detail, a little goes a very long way. Too much can make your image look unnatural and crunchy. And with blur, the goal is to add subtle softness, not to make your footage look like it was shot out of focus. So this is all about finding the right balance for your look. So we've now arrived at the final and arguably one of the most essential effects for achieving an authentic film look, which is a film grain. First, let's understand what grain is. It's not the same as digital noise. Digital noise is an ugly, unwanted electronic artifact from a camera sensor. Film grain is the beautiful, organic, physical texture of silver crystals that make up a frame of a celluloid film. Adding realistic grain is the number one thing that you can do to break up that sterile, perfect look of a digital sensor and make your image feel tangible and alive. It adds character and it can even help smooth out blending and gradients like a sky. Now as you look inside this compound node, you see a sharp and a blur node. And you don't need to worry about this at all. They're just part of my internal process for creating a more realistic grain reproduction. Your focus should be on these two options right here: the node set and the grain set. They have the exact same settings, but one has color saturation and one doesn't. So which one is better? Grain saturation is more technically accurate to how real film works, as grain on celluloid has subtle color information in it. The node set, on the other hand, or the monochrome grain, often gives a more polished and clean result that can look better to the eye. So there's no single right answer. It depends if you're aiming for pure realism or a pleasing aesthetic. Now I've preset the grain here to work well with most footage, but I still change it all the time based on the specific shot. So here's the workflow that I recommend. First, we gotta control where the grain appears. So we start in the advanced control section and look at the highlights, midtones, and shadow sliders. In real film, grain is most visible in the midtones and shadows, and almost invisible in the brightest highlights. So I suggest that you start pulling the midtones and shadow sliders up and down to see how you can control where the grain sits in your image to get the most realistic result. Next, you gotta control what the grain looks like. And for this, we're gonna go to the grain parameters. The main sliders to experiment with are the grain strength, the grain size, and the softness. You can also, if you want, use the main opacity slider. The settings will dictate the character of your grain. For example, an 8mm or 16mm film look will have a much bigger and stronger grain than a clean 35mm or 65mm look. So this brings me to the most important part. The key to using grain is to understand that grain should be felt, not be the main thing in your video. So many people get this wrong and add way too much grain. And yes, of course, that in some cases the grain is going to be strong, like a dark, underexposed 16mm shot, but you shouldn't just crank it up and apply it outdoor scene where real film will have little to no grain. You gotta feel the grain, make it part of the story, but not the main subject. Alright, so now we are entering the last few nodes in the entire power grade. Think of this small section as the final output effects and transformations. These are the very last adjustments made to the image before it gets converted into its final delivery format. So first up is the offset node. I want to be very clear about this node's purpose because its name can be a little confusing. This is not the same as the offset wheels. If you look inside, you see that this is actually a very simple luma curve adjustment. By default, I've already set this curve to pull the shadows down just a tiny bit, which adds a final touch of depth and richness to the image. But you have full control here. You can change this to lift the shadows if the entire image feels too dark, or even reset the node completely and use it to fix a last minute clipping issue, for example. However, and this is the most important point of this node, you should rarely, if ever, need to touch it. If you have built your grade correctly, following the steps we've gone through, setting your foundation in the primaries and making the final tweaks in the trim node, then your levels should already be perfect. This node is really just a final safety net. If you find yourself needing to change and make a big adjustment here, it's usually a sign that something went wrong earlier in the chain. The analogy of a master control for a slight overall brightness is perfect for this. But it's a control you should only use in an emergency. For a grade, everything looks great, so we are going to leave this node completely untouched, which is exactly what you should aim for in your own grades. Okay, the next few nodes, the gate weave and dust, are what I call the film damage and projection artifacts section. I want you to be very clear about these two effects. They're extremely niche. For 99.9% of the time, clean, modern projects you work on, these nodes should remain turned off. Their only purpose is to very specifically emulate the imperfections of projecting or handling physical film, which is only something you want for a distinct, vintage, or distressed look. So what are they? Gate weave simulates the slight organic movement of the film strip as it passes through the gate of a projector. It's that gentle jitter or float you sometimes see in very old film projections. Dust, as the name implies, adds simulated dust particles, specks, and scratches to the image, making it look like a film print that has been run through a projector many times. Now I have preset both of these effects to what I personally think is a good, very subtle starting point, but I have to be honest, I rarely use them myself. There are a lot of controls inside each of these nodes that allow you to customize the effects, but we won't be going through them in this tutorial as most of you will probably never need to touch them. They're fairly self-explanatory, however, and if you're curious, remember that you can always hover your cursor over the name of a setting to get a tooltip that explains what it does. The main takeaway is that these are highly specialized tools, and unless you're intentionally going for a vintage, damaged film look, you should leave this off. Alright, so now we are the final two nodes in our tree, which we've already talked about, so we'll go through this quickly. First is our DaVinci Wide Gamut to Rec 709 node. This is our final, crucial output transformation. It's a node that translates all of your hard work from the large DaVinci Wide Gamut color space into the standard Rec 709 space that most screens use. As we said at the very start, this should always be the last active node in your chain before you render. And last, of course, are our check nodes. You already know all about these. They are our diagnostic tools, your stethoscope for checking the health of your grade. And you should be turning them on and off throughout the whole process as needed. Alright, so before we move on to our final demonstration, I just want to say a massive and sincere thank you. Thank you to every single one of you who has supported my craft by investing in this power grade. This entire tutorial was made for you, and I truly hope that it helps you elevate your look. I highly recommend that you watch this tutorial over and over again until all the concepts really sink in. Also, as I said in the ebook for my very first power grade, once you understand the fundamentals of this workflow, I highly encourage you to make it your own. And what I mean by that is add things, mess with the controls, try new concepts you learn from other places. Honestly, this power grade will probably set you up for life. I don't plan on updating its core structure anytime soon, only creating new tools that can be added to it because I truly think that this is the best and most complete product out there. It has everything a colorist needs to create stunning images. However, the world of color grading is always evolving. I'll be launching new tools, other creatives will be launching new tools, DaVinci Resolve itself will launch new tools. So this is why you need to understand the core concepts we've talked about today, the why behind each step. Having that deep knowledge is what will empower you to know where and how to add on things to this workflow, to adapt and to continue to grow as an artist. So to wrap things up and show you how this all comes together in a practical session, you're now seeing grading a piece of footage from start to finish in real time with no cuts or interruptions so you can see the workflow in action.